Welcome to the Mortgage Podcast, where we give tactics, strategies, and inspiration to get you to 10 plus loans per month. We talk a lot about how to make a ton of money in mortgage while also being happy and thriving in your personal life. If you want to be a mortgage millionaire, you're in the right place. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Mortgage Podcast. Today, we have a fun topic, and that is the topic of mentorship. Well, my dad was a mentor of mine. He was a business mentor and a sales mentor. So I grew up with that, and I ended up running a company with him. And it was a great experience. Learning all the basics of sales and how many sales calls to make and how to track things, how to understand a P&L, how to understand a cash flow statement, how to understand a balance sheet, how to manage people. I'll never forget one day I was managing, it was a warehouse. There was about 14 employees and I was the manager. And they were all older than me, except for this one kid. I was having some problems with them showing up late really consistently. And my dad told me over dinner, he says, well, the next time he shows up late, fire him. And so sure enough, the next day he showed up late. And I said, hey, come over here. Today's your last day. You've showed up late too many times. I've warned you about it. I've put it in writing. You have to leave now. And he just starts bawling. I mean, this is like maybe 18-year-old kid. He says, Todd, you don't understand. He says, I'm the sole provider for my daughter. His mom is a drug addict and I've got sole custody. And if I lose this job, she'll have to go into foster care. And I remember looking at him and I said, you should have thought about that before you showed up late again. And I felt very bad about making that statement. I felt very bad about the whole situation. But it taught me that sometimes as a leader, you always have to hire, fire, and lay off people. And that's one of the sobering things about that. And it also taught me a lot about mentorship, because I went home and I told my dad and I said, Dad, I just feel horrible about this. He's crying. His newborn's going to go to foster care. And I told him the whole story. And he says, Todd, people make choices in their lives. And it's not your responsibility, the choices they make. And I'll never forget that conversation. So I went on to have a bunch of mentors. Joe Stumpf with Borrow for a Lonely was a big mentor of mine, taught me a lot. Obviously, Rick Ruby, who I started the core with and ran that with for 21 years. But I've had a lot of others along the way. And I want you to realize a mentor can come in many different shapes and sizes. So for example, they can be inside your industry or they could be outside your industry. As an example of that, I've learned a lot from John Maxwell's books. I've only seen him speak once, but I've read a lot of his books and they're easy to read and they made a lot of sense to me. So that's an example. I went to Alex Hormozi's 2-day event, and just how he looks at business and how he evaluates a business really changed how I think forever. So it can be a book, it doesn't have to be someone. There's a gentleman that I'm following right now that I would say is a mentor, and he's young. He's like 25 years old, but he's so good at communication about this particular topic that it just makes sense to me. And he uses visual aids and all this stuff. And I like him for his communication skills and the experience, even though he's young, how much he studied this subject. So I think sometimes mentors can be inside your business and sometimes they can be outside your business. Sometimes you can have a personal relationship with them. Sometimes it's from afar and you just, this YouTube podcaster, I may never meet him, but if you were to ask me 10 years from now, I learned a lot from him. So I think that is some context around mentorship. I think there's one reason to have mentors, and you could come up with 100 reasons, but I think the simplest reason is speed. So I want you to think of this in terms of money. The reason we would hire a mentor is to get somewhere in business. I'm using this context in business, 5 years faster or 10 years faster than we would have done on our own. So to me, it boils down to one thing, and that is speed. Can they get me there faster? Can they avoid, business is one of those things where you make a mistake and that mistake can plague you for 10 or 20 years. What you're trying to do is get there faster through knowledge, through experience, through having someone that's less emotional about the business or the decision you're making so that you can make a better decision. So the number one reason to have a mentor is to speed up the process. Going back to the money equation, if someone starts saving money, say 30 years ago, and I used this example at a talk I gave last week to a group. If someone started a self-employed pension plan and they put in 72 grand a year, you can put in those, and they did that for 30 years, they would have 4.3 million, if I remember right, if the money grew at 10%. Whereas if that person started saving 10 years ago instead of 30 years ago, they might have 800,000, for example, or 600,000. I'd have to run the math, but it would be a lot less. And to me, that's the whole concept of mentorship, is to increase the speed. You could get there faster with someone helping you and mentoring you. The last thing I want to touch on around mentorship is qualifications. So to me, there's three things. Number one is what I call the bigger pile principle. And this is something we taught in the core. Rick Ruby coined that phrase. But what it's about is, if I want to learn about relationships or how to have a great marriage, I would probably talk to someone that has a really healthy, happy marriage over 40 years or 30 years or 50 years. So they have a bigger pile. If I'm talking about money, I would try and learn from someone that has 3, 4, 5, 10 times my net worth, right? There's some context to this. Say someone had a chance to be taught by a billionaire. They're worth $3 billion, but you have $20,000 in your checking account. That's all the money you have. That's probably too big of a mentor, right? It's probably too much out of scale. What you're trying to find in general, the best mentors have a bigger pile in whatever area we're talking about. In other words, they have more results, but it's not to the point to where it's, so far away that they're trying to teach you stuff or remember stuff that they learned 30 years ago. So I think that the bigger pile is simply saying, hey, someone has a lot of results, a lot more results by 5 or 10 times than I do in that area. The second thing is, what is their long-term experience? And the reason I say this is we live in an era where there's a lot of motivation, there's a lot of social media and podcasting, but I see people all the time and they are teaching about things that they've been doing for 2 years. So they might be 2 years ahead of you, but they haven't been doing it 10 years. And they haven't been through a down cycle in that business. So what is their experience level in terms of years? And it's a big difference to learn from someone that's been doing something for 20 or 30 years as opposed to 2 or 4 years. And so I think experience matters. There are exceptions to this where you just find someone and they're just a real superstar in a matter of months, but that may be one out of 5,000 teachers. So I think there's exceptions to everything, but in general, I would look for more of that long-term experience. The third one is something that I think a lot of people miss, and that is communication skills. So does someone have the communication skills to be able to sit down with you and get you to understand and implement a concept that is maybe kind of complicated, but they're able to explain it in a way, in steps where it just makes sense to you? I know for me, I tend to be a very visual learner. So when I started taking golf lessons again, about 4 months ago, I made the instructor take slow-mo videos of me on my camera. And at first he didn't think it was weird. I'm like, nope, like every lesson we're doing this. And then I go home and I'm watching those slow-mo videos so I can see the mistakes that I'm making or when I do it right, and I can see my progress. And that's an example of me understanding how I learn. But if I wouldn't have said that to him, my golf instructor wouldn't have done it. He would have lessons, and then I have no reference as to when I did it right or when I did it wrong. So I think the ability for that mentor to communicate with you at your level in a way that you understand is extremely important. So those are some tips that I have around mentorship. It's important because when you entrust someone to direct you in a certain area of your life, if that mentor doesn't know how to communicate with you, or they don't have the experience, or they don't really have results in that area, they're actually going to lead you astray. And I see that happen a lot where people say and do things because they're trying to sell a service, but they don't really have the capabilities to truly help you. And so I wanted to do this short podcast so that it gave you some reference point on, hey, what does a really good mentor look like? And what do they feel like? What do they taste like? So that you can make a good decision. And the last thing I'll say about mentorship is this: you have to aggressively pursue. The easy mentors that come your way are typically going to be selling something. They're usually kind of desperate. They're looking for an income. And the best people you need to pursue. So I'll give you an example. I am working on a project with a gentleman I got introduced to. I've talked to him several times. He calls me last week and he says, hey, do you want to go to the Lakers playoff game? I've got tickets. It's down in LA. So I really don't want to take a day and a half out of my schedule. But because this is a mentor who I really want to get to know, that has super specialized skills and big results in a certain area, I'm going to take a day and a half out of my life to go spend a few hours with him so that I can get to know him, so that I endear myself to him, so he wants to help me more. That is something that I don't see a lot of people do. I know in 24 years of mentoring and coaching people, I could count on two hands how many people aggressively pursued, say, myself. And I have this conversation with other mentors. Most people just don't call you. They don't aggressively pursue you. Mentors only has so much time and attention, so they're not really going to pursue you, because if they're good, they're already busy, right? They're already productive doing things. And so how do you spot that person? It's kind of like in sales. If you meet with, say you're a loan officer, you meet with a realtor that does 10 deals a year. Okay, maybe stay in touch with them. But you meet with someone that does 100 deals a year, that person is someone you want to aggressively pursue. And you actually want to discriminate against the 10 deal a month realtor versus the 100 deal a year realtor, because it's 10 times the opportunity. That same concept is the same thing you want to apply to mentorship. So I hope that helps. Have a beautiful week. Please share this with someone. This is one of those that you could share with any business person that you think is in need of or searching out mentorship, and they would get some tips. Okay. Have a beautiful week.